to a number of our international leaders from other caucuses this week. I'm happy that many of them are here today. We have a small delegation from the government of France. Thank you, sir. We have some Mongolians as well. Thank you for extending your trip and traveling a long distance to be here. I'd like to acknowledge our friends from the Norwegian Embassy who are also here for this important conversation. And then lastly, sorry to go so long, but I do want to take a moment to recognize our Conservation Council members, many of whom are in this room. So thank you very much for your ongoing partnership. So good to see so many of you. So I am happy to begin this program by introducing Congressman Scott Peters of California. As I mentioned, he is leading a lot of really important work on climate and trade issues on the House side. He's also a member of the U.S. International Conservation Caucus, as well as the House Senate Climate Solutions Caucus. He currently serves on the House Budget Committee, the House Energy and Commerce Committee, as well as the Joint Economic Committee. So Congressman Peters is certainly in a key position to lead on these important issues. Ranked fourth most independent Democrat in Congress by the National Journal, Congressman Peters understands the importance of finding bipartisan solutions to challenges we face and is never afraid to work across party lines to build consensus and get things done. So that's why we're very excited to have him here today for remarks. Thanks, Congressman.
Thanks very much. That fourth most independent Democrat thing, the Republicans like it better than the Democrats. Thanks for hosting us today. Thanks for inviting me to talk about what I think is a pretty important issue in the marriage of climate and trade. And I want to emphasize, first of all, that I am pro-trade. I was one of the 28 Democrats who supported the TPP under President Obama. Still think a lot of those issues need to be resolved. So let's have that as part of our context for today. But also pro-climate action. So there's clearly a market failure here. Some countries, like our allies in the EU, are moving forward with ambitious climate plans and targets that are aligned with what the science demands. At the same time, other nations are continuing to subsidize inefficient and dirty coal and not treating climate change like the crisis that it is. Climate change, we know, is a global problem, and there's simply no way to address it unless we create an international trade regime around our climate values. And while in the past we've prioritized cheap products, no matter the consequences, I think we need to facilitate better trade, but also incorporate climate strategies. Climate's also an opportunity for the United States. I certainly don't think we should weaken our environmental standards to compete with other nations. We can remain a global economic leader by raising our ambition to provide the clean products and fuels that the world is increasingly demanding. And as we do this, we have to ensure that our emissions and our jobs aren't simply moving to countries with less stringent standards. So through bipartisanship and global cooperation, our goal is to create an alliance of nations that collaborate to raise our mutual climate ambition. So with this in mind, I introduced the Fair Transition and Competition Bill with Senator Coons. In short, the bill establishes a border carbon adjustment, BCA, on carbon-intensive imports to account for the cost incurred by United States businesses to comply with laws and regulations limiting greenhouse gases. It requires the implementation of the BCA to be consistent with international agreements, including free trade agreements, and requires the State Department and USTR to engage with other countries regarding promoting climate through trade and ensuring fairness in the application of climate-related tariffs. And it uses revenues to invest in high-impact energy innovation in a state grant program focused on transition assistance, environmental justice, and climate resilience. We're trying to accomplish a few goals here. First, we want to create a global approach to addressing climate change. The U.S. only produces around 10% of global emissions. Most emissions growth is going to come from China and the developing world. And this legislation, if coupled with a global inclusive carbon alliance, will help ensure nations are incentivized to invest in clean technologies. Second, we want to drive a clean, flourishing, and advanced U.S. energy industry. the United States can maintain its energy independence, export its clean energy resources, and address climate change simultaneously. Our plan will ensure that the U.S. remains the global leader in producing cheap, clean, and reliable energy while protecting United States jobs and reducing reliance on foreign energy sources. Third, we want to strengthen the United States' competitiveness. A lot of U.S. businesses are more carbon efficient than their competitors across the world and already face many climate laws and regulations and expenses. Our plan will facilitate a race to the top among U.S. corporations and produce the next generation of clean energy and technology, and to ensure that United States companies remain globally competitive as they innovate to address the climate crisis. Fourth, we want to maintain U.S. global leadership. This bill will ensure that the United States remains a key player in international cooperation on climate action and will show the world that we are fully committed to addressing the climate crisis at home and abroad. Fifth, we want to invest in Americans. The bill uses the revenues to invest in high-impact energy innovation, to reduce energy costs for consumers, and invest in state grants to ensure an equitable and resilient transition to a clean energy economy. So I want to be clear that this bill is in the nature of an opening offer, right? We're eager to work with our domestic and international counterparts to find workable, fair, and effective international climate and trade regimes. And I believe this can and should be a bipartisan process. Maintaining the competitiveness and ensuring U.S. companies do not face unfair competition abroad is a bipartisan priority. Trade has always been that. Simultaneously, there's a national security angle here. We have to push back on the Chinese and Russians and ensure that U.S. energy and technology is dominating the global energy landscape through the 21st century. Whether we like it or not, incorporating climate policy into a trade is going to be part of these efforts. The last thing I'll say is that regardless of the exact climate and energy policies we implement in the coming decades, we need to focus on developing new international trade regime that incorporates climate. I still believe that the most effective and efficient way to do this is by establishing an economy-wide technology neutral price on carbon. I want to continue working toward that. That will make the accounting for this a lot easier as well. Carbon pricing is an essential tool. Even a modest carbon price could generate more than $1 trillion to fund new investments and provide rebates to lower and middle income Americans, ensuring that any burden falls to polluters rather than on working Americans. Pricing pollution will also substantially reduce greenhouse gas emissions and improve local air pollution, preventing thousands of pollution deaths annually. And it's unlikely we can meet our carbon goals on time without carbon pricing. Maybe that we can meet them at all. Related to trade, we can't ignore developments in other parts of the world as well. People don't like me to talk about this, but we are playing a little bit of defense here when the EU's carbon price is over $60 a ton. The United Kingdom came out with $70 a ton, and to the north, Canada is planning to increase its carbon tax to $170 a ton by 2030. We can't expect that they're not going to ask us to look at adjustments across the border in their favor as well. So if we fail to act, we could face punitive border policies that could hurt industry and consumers. So like I said, there's a lot of work to be done in developing the way we would account for this because we don't have a carbon price, but even with a carbon price, it's something we're going to have to be planning for. And I look forward to working with you all to make sure we get something that's workable and helps us compete and solve this problem at the same time. I'd be happy to take a couple questions if that's okay. Ma'am?
Lori Pickford from Citizens for Responsible Energy Solutions. Were you successful in getting your proposal included in the House reconciliation?
I don't know what's in the House reconciliation. So I will say, I must tell you that that is a work in progress. I will ask though, but they're racing to come up with I guess they made some announcement today about a framework that's a Wyden-Neal framework, but it's really unformed, the whole thing. And I think that that people don't want to say anything to people that they don't want to hear, but the number that we come up with is going to not start with a 3. It's going to probably start with a 1. And we've got a long way to go to figure out what that looks like. But it's a good suggestion. Sir?
Honorable French Senator, I'm very, very interested by your presentation. Thank you. Maybe a question. I absolutely agree with you. Price of carbon is absolutely crucial if you want to stabilize CO2 emission at the world level. This point will be, I think, the most important point of the negotiation in Glasgow, Article 6, with a very, very hard negotiation, and with China first, of course. You have some contact, some common strategy with European Union, because European Union defend a price carbon in the border too at this moment, to have a common strategy in Glasgow?
Do I? I think that I tend to, I'm going to attend with Senator Coons, his group, and we're going to talk about pricing. My strategy is to get you to put pressure on my country to do a carbon price. I think that's a fair thing to ask, and I hope you will. And I will receive the demand willingly. Couple more, sir.
With ESS, we manufacture long-duration batteries for our grid right here in the United States. So we applaud your efforts, but as that number that you referenced for reconciliation creeps from 3 to 1, we hope we can count on your support for Senator Wyden's investment tax credit proposal for American manufactured energy storage with a domestic content bonus so that we can compete more fairly with some of our state subsidized foreign competitors who use a much more carbon intensive manufacturing process and frankly produce batteries that are dangerous for our grid.
I would just say one thing, thanks for asking the question. One thing I would just suggest to you is that what will be the last thing to be cut in the reconciliation will be the climate stuff. One, because I think everyone sees it as a priority. Second, because our rules as Democrats don't require us to pay for COVID or climate, so it gives us more flexibility. And I do support, even if we had a nice carbon price, I would support incentivizing new industries to make sure that they get off the ground. And so I think that's the kind of thing we would want to save. Sir?
So I'm from the region of Appalachia, northeastern Kentucky. And I have seen our regional economy and thousands of jobs lost by the pursuit of doing what I think we need to do, which is moving beyond coal. But as we've seen the reduction in the coal industry, we've had thousands of jobs lost in this particular region with no solid proposals for helping these people. And we've seen as a result of this an opioid pandemic, you know, a lack of critical infrastructure, and entire communities that have lost their income base. And as a member of this region, I have not seen any meaningful policy proposed which will either replace these jobs, bring in new green energy to offer new employment to these people, or really anything to help this region that has been affected by policies which we need to pursue green energy.
I would just say the question is about the effects on a state like Kentucky of the transition away from legacy energy jobs. And on the good side, I would say that there's an interest in funding those programs to exist. I'm not sure that we have. There's also an interest now in place-based economic development, so it's targeted away from communities like mine that are doing very, very well. But far be it from me as a San Diegan to tell you how to transition in Kentucky. I think we need to work on that, and I acknowledge that. But I do think that one of the features of this bill and the carbon taxes proposals that Senator Coons and I talked about, it would reserve money for transitioning those communities. By the way, I think as we go forward with respect to trade in general, I think you'll see more attention to even though I think trade provides tremendous benefits, the net benefits are undisputed. I think that for communities that are where there is dislocation or where the things don't go well, I think you'll see more focus on make sure there's a good transition. All right.
Time for one more.
One more? no appetite for one. Oh, sir.
Good morning. Hubert Julien-Lafayette, a member of the French Parliament. And I actually chair the French delegation to the International Parliamentary Union. It's the World Organization of Parliament, and the issue of conservation and, of course, climate change have really raised in the organization. And the fact is that United States, the Congress of the United States left the organization, I think, about 20 years ago. And I think it would be a good time for the American Congress to get back to the International Organization of Parliament. So I don't know if you can help.
Where do you meet?
Excuse me?
Where do you meet?
We meet in Geneva, and sometimes, in some other countries.
I'm sold. Sounds good to me.
And more and more on Zoom. More and more on Zoom.
Zoom's not so good, but it's easy. Let me just say that's a great invitation, and let's follow up with that.
I just said that we need you, actually.
Okay, thank you. And I would just say thank you very much for doing this. It's important. We'll look forward to hearing with you. I'm going to make one extraneous comment that I would like your help with too. I am interested in American foreign policy around energy. I'm really concerned that there's a lot of cheap coal out there in other parts of the world. You made me think of this because it's not cheap in Kentucky anymore. I hope that we can encourage the State Department and the administration to think about exporting good American energy from the United States to other places, so that as people get the development and the wealth that they deserve, they do it on the backs of clean energy. Also, if you have a way, and you all know ideas for me to promote, to save rainforests, and I would love to know kind of what you think the federal government, after this, tell me what you think the federal government should be doing to encourage the good health of the lungs of the world, all those rainforests, and we'd love to work with you on that as well. Thank you again for all you do, and we'll see you around.
Wonderful. Thank you, Congressman. Thank you for your leadership. Thank you for your comments today, and your leadership on climate issues. Next in our program, I'd like to invite Heather Reams. She's the Executive Director of Citizens for Responsible Energy Solutions. She's also the chair of National Clean Energy Week, which is going on right now in its 5th year. She is going to give us her high-level perspective on the week and our conversation today. So thank you very much, Heather.
Cool, thanks. I'm going to put this back up here. Look at my notes. Hey, how are you? Wow, what a full room. Hey, so I'm Heather Reams, Executive Director of Citizens for Responsible Energy Solutions. CRESS, we go by CRESS. CRESS is a right-of-center organization. We engage Republicans on conservative policies about climate change, clean energy. I've been with CRESS for 5 years. I'm going to tell you that what's changed in the last 5 years about the conversations around climate, not just on conservation, which was a comfortable issue for conservatives, but more about clean energy, climate, thinking about global emissions more than right here just in our own backyard. And I think it evolved over time. It's a really exciting time to lead an organization that's bringing Republicans to the table. On my other hat, which I'm also wearing this week, I look great in hats, by the way. My other hat this week is I'm chair of National Clean Energy Week. And you're like, well, I didn't know there was Clean Energy Week. Well, it's the 5th year of Clean Energy Week, and I'm 5 years at my organization. So when I started at CRESS, I said, well, where's the awareness about clean energy? There's got to be, there's like a donut day, there's a martini day, there's anything for recognition, but what about for clean energy? And some of my colleagues say, well, there's Earth Day. I'm like, well, that's a day. Like, what about a week? We don't have it. Like, well, let's create it. So we did. That's really how it happened. It was that, and we've been, by the backbone of it, but it's growing and growing. I'm just blown away by the different events and having opportunities like this to talk about clean energy in a bipartisan way. And that is very much what National Clean Energy Week is about, is bipartisanship and how do we work together. There's a lot of common ground. It's a lot of common ground. So let's grab that common ground and run. Wanted just to share a couple things about Clean Energy Week overall, so I would encourage you to want to engage. We have 140 participating organizations, which means you like clean energy, you want to participate, that's cool. You just sign up. We have resolutions in both the House and the Senate. In Congress, we have, let's see, 78 members bipartisan as a resolution signing on to clean energy. Clean energy is good. Thank you, Lori, from my team for doing that. And 15 senators also recognizing clean energy, bipartisan again. So it's a bipartisan issue. There's a lot of low-hanging fruit. We also have about 30 governors and the mayor of DC who have also claimed it Clean Energy Week and recognizing the value of clean energy. So it's awareness. And then the rest of it, it's up to each organization. So that's a little bit about Clean Energy Week. About CRESS, we're really looking at not just the domestic issues here, but the global issues. Next month after next in November, we'll be bringing a congressional delegation over to COP and bringing Republicans to have a conversation about climate. If we're going to lead, how can we lead as the United States? We're back in Paris. But if we're regulating here in the United States, what does that mean about global emissions? What does it mean for China? What does it mean for India? And how can we help export our technologies abroad? Not just our tax regimes, but our technologies abroad. I know that we're going to have a conversation about that today, but we're thinking a lot about that as we're going towards international dialogue. It's an international problem. How can the United States take a role internationally? I'll leave it there, but it's a pleasure to address you, and I'm so thrilled to have such an awesome program you've got here. And Christy, thank you for your leadership.
Thank you for everything you have going on this week. We really appreciate you're able to take the time to be here with us. Next, I'd like to go to the meat of our panel discussion, of our event, which is our expert panel discussion on climate and trade. We have three great experts. I'm going to provide some brief background on them so you know who they are, and then we're going to jump right into a robust fireside chat. First, I'm pleased to introduce Katrina Rourke. She's Vice President over at the Climate Leadership Council, where she manages their program and supports the Council's advocacy and outreach activities. This is one of the challenges of being my height, right? Previously, Katrina built the Energy and Environment program over at the R Street Institute, a center-right think tank in town, and then previous to that, she also led the energy environment portfolio at the American Action Forum. As a legislative assistant to the former U.S. Rep. Bob Inglis of South Carolina, Katrina helped craft the first Republican-sponsored carbon tax bill. She began her career as a presidential management fellow with the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Association. So she's no stranger to climate conversations here in town. Next, I'd like to introduce Sarah Stewart. She has nearly 2 decades of experience as an international trade lawyer, policy expert, and negotiator. Immediately prior to joining her current role at the Silverado Policy Accelerator, where she's executive director, she led the policy efforts at Amazon on U.S. trade policy and export control matters. From 2013 to 2018, Sarah worked for the Office of the United States Trade Rep, with her most recent position being the Deputy Assistant United States Trade Representative for Environment and Natural Resources. That may be the longest one I've heard, actually. But I'm sure that the adage where there's an inverse relationship between the length of your title and your importance does not hold true in your case. So Sarah began her career as a trade lawyer at the offices of Stewart & Stewart, where she worked for 6 years on behalf of U.S. manufacturing companies and workers. So she has great experience here. And then last but not least, we have Dave Banks, who is certainly a thought leader on climate change, energy, and trade. Until recently, he was the chief strategist for the Republican side of the House Select Committee on Climate Crisis. He's published many peer-reviewed articles, reports, and opinion editorials on a variety of issues, including climate change, civil nuclear power, energy markets, and trade. Dave was previously also President Trump's Special Assistant for International Energy and the Environment at the National Economic Council and the National Security Council. He was previously Republican Deputy Staff Director for the Senate Committee on Environment and Public Works, Senior Advisor on the International Affairs and Climate Change for President George W. Bush, and a State Department Foreign Service Officer and CIA Program Analyst. He's won a number of awards. We look very forward to hearing him, Katrina, and Sarah. So I'd love to invite you all up to the stage where I'll ask you a few questions, and then we can take several from the audience. I know that we have a ton of insight here, and I certainly want to pull that into our conversation. So please come up. Well, while everyone is getting mic'd up, I'll throw out the first question. Initially, I'm eager to hear everyone's initial reactions to some of the great speakers that we heard today, both Congressman Peters and the work that he's leading with Senator Coons, as well as the comments and perspective that we heard from Heather Reams. Katrina, would you like to begin, and then we'll hear from Sarah and Dave?
Sure, thanks. It's really a pleasure to be with y'all today. We're talking about issues near and dear to my heart, so I'm sure I'll opine to start. I work at the Climate Leadership Council, but it is my great privilege to also be on the board of Citizens for Responsible Energy Solutions Forum. They're the people who come up with all the really terrific policy ideas that CREST advances, and it's a total joy. CREST is making a difference in how everybody talks about clean energy and the opportunities in promoting new solutions for our future. I could not be more invested in the work of National Clean Energy Week. I'm really glad to see that the program continues to grow year after year. I also was really pleased to hear the remarks from Congressman Peters, and we are in virtual agreement on those. So more ambitious climate policies can and should be the anchor of a better competitive position for the United States, not just because we can make the technologies of the future here at home, but because we can unlock a competitive benefit for U.S. manufacturers today. That's achievable. Right now, we don't have a global approach that links climate change and trade considerations. And because of that, we find opportunities for our competitors to undermine clean U.S. manufacturers, clean manufacturers worldwide, by being more emissive, using cruder practices. Our trade rules allow for and expand upon that advantage. It's an oversight that we have in the global system, and we can and should rectify it. At the Climate Leadership Council, we work on a policy called the Baker-Schultz Carbon Dividends Plan. It puts a price on carbon. It sends all of the revenue that it collects to households to make sure more American families are better off with a carbon price than they are without it. We include regulatory simplification, so we use the best tools at our disposal to reduce emissions, and we employ a border carbon adjustment, which we'll talk about a whole lot today. So yeah, thank you. Thank you for having me. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Hey, is your mic on?
Yeah, I think
Would love to hear from you, Sarah.
I'm from New Jersey. I have a loud voice, so hopefully I can just project here. Exactly. Well, thanks, Christine. It's an honor to be here. See a lot of familiar faces. As Christine mentioned, I'm working now with the Silverado Policy Accelerator. We are a new think and do tank. Our hope is to find the best policy solutions to pressing challenges, climate change being one of them, and then really accelerate their implementation. I've worked in government, our co-founders have as well, and so we know that a lot of times getting policies over the finish line is an unsexy but very necessary to get into the details, to stay the course. So I wanted to just tell a quick anecdotal story that hopefully will get a chuckle. And it's really relevant to what we're talking about here today. I'm not going to name the name of the country that we were negotiating with, and you might be able to figure this out. But we were at a negotiating round when I was working with USTR, and the other country was pushing us to deal with climate change in the FTA negotiations. And for a whole host of political reasons, we weren't able to. And so the other side invited their climate negotiator to come and give a whole presentation on why we should do this. And as he was walking out the door, I said, "Thank you so much, you were never here." And he looked at me quizzically, and I said, Because in the US, we are not linking trade and climate. And actually, it's a political lightning rod. And that was true 5-6 years ago when this took place. I'm really encouraged to have this conversation starting to take place. It's super important. This isn't just an environmental issue. This is an economics issue. This is a national security issue. This is a competitiveness issue. This isn't just, save the forest, which, by the way, I think is absolutely critical, but it's not just that. It's jobs at stake. And, Congressman Peters and Senator Coons' leadership to try and tee up a way forward. It may not be perfect. It's going to be iterated on, no doubt, but it is a starting point for a discussion that's long overdue.
Well, there's not a whole lot to add there, but I mean, I agree with both of you. But no, I do really appreciate the thought leadership of Senator Coons and Congressman Peters, because I really do think that this is a policy that we really need to dig into. And by the way, I do, as a Republican, I think for Republicans, we've long struggled with what we consider to be, and by the way, and I think it's a false solution, or not a false solution, but it's false choice. Thank you. in that if we acknowledge that climate change is a problem, then we're stuck with policies that are burdensome, that reduce our competitiveness, et cetera. And I think that this is actually a policy. If we merge climate and trade the right way, I mean, and you'll see Katrina's, some of her work in a bit, but we can certainly monetize the carbon advantage that we have. And I think that flips that traditional narrative on its head and makes Republicans really start thinking about, okay, things are different now. This is not the Kyoto conversation, which would have been impossible for us to actually achieve. This is very different. We've gained significantly. I'm not going to steal your thunder, but we've gained significantly in our carbon efficiency, and we can create a climate trade policy, that actually works for the United States and works for Republican constituencies, and helps kind of lay the groundwork for a bipartisan compromise on this. I would agree that that the Coons-Peters bill needs some Republican input, right, to make it better. But I do think it's a really great starting point for discussion, and I really appreciate their work on that.
That's great. Thanks so much for those initial reactions. I'd like to start with Katrina first. I know that you've published quite a few reports on America's carbon advantage, and I'm wondering if you could give the audience an overview of your findings. I'm curious to know how a policy like this could be helpful in encouraging countries that pollute a lot, such as China, to boost their carbon mitigation efforts.
Sure. This is the price you pay for your lunch. You have to walk through all of my data. So
Trapped.
At the Climate Leadership Council, we work with a whole lot of companies that represent a variety of economic sectors, and they have given us input on developing this part of the proposal, the border carbon adjustment that we're talking about here today. During that input process, we kept finding these threads where these companies knew that they were a lot cleaner than their competitors, but they were only threads. We didn't have a data tool to look at the relative carbon intensity of production across the economy compared to international partners. And so at the council, we built one. And this is, I'm sorry, the output from our first study called America's Carbon Advantage. We took trade data, international trade data from economic sectors between 64 countries and the rest of the world. We fed into that trade data the carbon intensity of the energy commodities that those economies choose to use, and we can compare for the first time the relative carbon intensity of production across economic sectors across countries. In this chart, I'm showing you USMCA countries, BRIC countries, the European Union, and a world average. But we have this data for a whole lot more countries, so if you don't see your favorite, let me know, I can find it for you. We've indexed U.S. carbon intensity to 1. If a box is red, that means that economic sector in that country is more carbon intensive than the U.S. Blue, less carbon intensive than the U.S. major trading partners. We do not and cannot monetize this carbon advantage today. A major punchline from this graphic, which you probably can't see, is that it takes 80% more carbon emissions to create the same dollar of value anywhere else in the world as it does in the United States. 80% more emissions if we make something somewhere else. That's a huge advantage for US manufacturers. If you look at China, India, Russia, we're talking 3 to 4 times the amount of carbon emissions that we create in the United States to create the same exact things. The US economy is a whole heck of a lot cleaner. And this can be the foundation for uniting a climate ambition with a more competitive US economy and change the game on how we talk about what it means to be climate ambitious on the international stage. Okay, so we have an advantage. What does it mean if we deploy it? So we study the steel industry. Steel industry is pretty unique. They've been trying to maximize carbon efficiency, lower carbon emissions for a variety of reasons. They are also a commodity, which means commodity research firms study them all the time. Commodity research firms now, for the first time, are adding to their slates the ability to look at carbon intensity by facility. So we have a sort of unique view into this industry, and this is our starting point. If we compare the US carbon intensity of steel production against all of our trading partners, we win. The United States does not trade with a country whose steel sector is cleaner than our own. It doesn't matter if you're talking about flats, like car doors, or longs, like rumble cages, the United States is cleaner. So if we price carbon emissions from US steel and our competitors' steel, US manufacturers will win. So we figured out by how much. If we impose a carbon price on imports and US production, we're going to cut imports in half. We'll increase the sale of domestic steel 10%, and we'll increase the profitability of the domestic steel industry 40%. These are real economic benefits that we can unlock just by pricing carbon emissions. Incidentally, we're able to unlock this advantage at every steel facility in the US. In the model that we ran, there is no spare capacity remaining if we price carbon. And that allows us to deliver real significant economic benefits across every major steel producing region. I thought we were going to see economic losers when I ran this analysis, so I had the market research firm that we worked with, CRU, give us a regional breakdown. There are no losers in the United States. This is an economic win. So, okay, we get it. How can a policy like this help China mitigate their emissions? First, we're going to remove the competitive advantage from using outdated and crude manufacturing technologies. And two, we're going to create sort of a best-in-show model where we're showing that climate ambition is directly linked to short-term economic success. So this isn't only about unlocking long-term climate benefits, unlocking long-term innovation, ensuring deployment. It's about creating real new investment, new jobs today because of an existing advantage we have.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much for all of your research and your findings. Before we get to Sarah, I want to let everyone know that I had my team check with the venue, and they're checking on our lunches, and they should be coming soon. So if you're half as hangry as I am, I could definitely empathize. So sorry for the delay, but hopefully we'll have our lunches brought out soon. Sarah, you're a former USTR trade and environment negotiator. I love the anecdote that you shared with us earlier. I think it's so interesting to understand how this actually works in practice, right? So you have direct experience in engaging China and other major polluters. I'm curious to know your thoughts on what you think we should support, whether we should support or should not support some sort of policy like the one we're talking today, known as a border carbon adjustment.
Yeah, happy to give you my thoughts on that. I mean, I think as a country, we've obviously made significant strides to lower our emissions, because Katrina just, put the proof in the pudding there. And I think, the intention is that the Paris Agreement has set the rest of the world on a track to meet their climate commitments. And there's a lot of efforts underway, but we needed to do more with less yesterday. And so, you know, when the IPCC report comes out and says that we have a code red for humanity, I don't think it's an understatement. And I think it really amps up the pressure to find a high impact solution that we can implement now. I think the U.S. needs to continue to do its part, and it's doing a lot. But as we all know, emissions do not know borders. And so long as there are countries out there that are not doing their part, we have a problem. Obviously, we would love to be able to have everybody on the same path, you know, evolving as science dictates that we need to evolve, but that simply isn't the case. So we need to take stock as a country. We need to look at who shares our vision of saving this planet and is taking the necessary steps to get there. Then we need to look at who wants to do that but doesn't have the means. And then lastly, we need to look at who is playing the short game above all else. And I think it's in that last basket that the legislation that Representative Peters was talking about is trying to address. Pollution havens, countries that are looking at, you know, making a buck, getting that economic leg up, you know, beating out other people's products in third country markets. And that does require us to think about creative solutions. What I would say though is that, as you know, my own experience is that a defensive posture alone isn't going to save the day. We need some holistic strategy that has carrots and sticks. So I have a three-pronged strategy I would lay out. The first is we need to be able to reward like-minded countries, right? This could be done in a lot of ways. We could have agreements on two-way, you know, further trade liberalization on environmental products and environmental technologies. We could look to agree that, you know what, your system's pretty good, my system's pretty good, especially in relation to other countries. So let's just agree that I'm not going to put a tax on you, you're not going to put a tax on me. And you know, maybe some like deepened cooperation. And I think these are like the rough outlines of a carbon club, right? Something that everybody wants to join if they're like-minded and doing the right thing. But it can't stand on its own for the reasons that I said, right? We also have to level the playing field. And this is where the concept of a carbon border adjustment or carbon tax comes in. We have to have a leveling mechanism. So that's a second prong. But the third prong is we need to think about a large group of least developed countries and lower middle income countries, many of whom have pretty bad emissions, want to do the right thing, don't have the technologies to do it because they're not producing those technologies like wind turbines, solar panels, water filtration, wastewater, pumps, all of these things. They don't have it at their disposal. So what can we do to help them climb the ladder, but also support good paying US jobs and US exports? I think that there's a trade-off to be made there. We can help them with the technologies to climb the ladder, and in exchange, maybe they don't get a full exemption from, you know, a carbon border adjustment, but maybe there's some trade-off that we can make there. So, you know, in sum, I think that there's a holistic regime that we need to be looking at. Carbon border adjustment is one piece.
That's fascinating. I mean, when you have something as complicated as this, I think it's certainly good to have a coordinated approach. So really good to hear your thoughts on how we can structure that, Sarah. I think that's great. Dave, I know you talk a lot about the importance of finding national consensus on climate change. And we heard from a lot of centrist Democrats here on this. We've also heard a lot of themes that appeal to Republicans. I'm curious to know your thoughts on whether the merger of climate and trade policy will find support from Republicans, and if so, why?
You know, that's a really good question. And by the way, I wouldn't be here if I didn't think that was the case, right? So it kind of answers itself. But, you know, look, I don't think Republicans are ready to talk about a specific policy design, right, including a border carbon adjustment. But I think from a high level concept, yes, I think there's a lot of interest in trying to figure out how do you merge climate and trade policy, how do you take advantage of US carbon efficiency, how do you monetize that, right? And there are specific objectives that really fit very well with GOP priorities. Number one would be, look, we want to return the supply chain, or we want to get as much of the supply chain back as we can, right? If you merge climate trade policy the right way, you get a lot of that supply chain back. Republicans really support the idea of resurrecting our manufacturing, right? If you do this the right way, that's what happens. We want to rein in the Chinese, right? We want to rein in the Chinese state-owned enterprises and reduce their growing influence in the global economy. And let's just make no mistake about it. If we don't get creative and think outside the box, Chinese state-owned enterprises they're only going to increase in importance when it comes to control of the global economy. Okay, if we do this the right way, a really smart way, we rein them in. Okay, and keep in mind that from a climate perspective, Chinese state-owned enterprises account for at least half of China's greenhouse gases, right? And currently China accounts for about 30% of global emissions. I think Congressman Peters said the U.S. was around 10, a little over 10 perhaps. But I think that if you just kind of cut across the political priorities in the foreign policy and domestic economic space that Republicans have, there is a recognition that if you do this the right way, you're cutting across and achieving a lot of objectives at the same time.
Well, to draw more illustration on your point, China also seems to be, my understanding is that they're the last public financier of coal-fired power plants, while the rest of the world's ECAs are moving away from that and closer to sustainable financing. Does this group, I know like USTR would have a strong input here, but thoughts on that, on how we can leverage our, not just the trade piece, but the public financing piece?
So by the way, just a few days ago, the Chinese announced at UNGA, at the UN, that they were going to end public financing of coal plants. I haven't seen any details overseas, public financing of coal plants overseas. I haven't seen any details on that, so I don't know what it means. I think some people are being overly optimistic and they think that China will pull the plug on the projects that it already has in the queue. I don't think that will happen. Yeah. And so I think we need to just see what the details are. But I will say this, and this is a really important point, is that so if you look at the current administration, the Europeans, and some of our other allies, we're trying to figure out how do you help accelerate the shift away from carbon-intensive energy production, electricity, power, whatever, to something lower carbon. How do you leverage those public finance tools? And that is a really difficult thing to achieve if the Chinese aren't playing ball with that, right? And if you merge climate trade the right way, and I will say this too, and I was really happy that Congressman Peters emphasized this, is that I don't know why we would do this if we're not forming a carbon club, right? And that is with our treaty allies, and this is where our interests align, because we all know that representative democracies, richer economies generally are cleaner. Well, those representative democracies just happen to be our treaty allies. The EU, the UK, Japan, Korea, Canada, right? And so I think that using climate as a means to strengthen that security alliance is really important. But if you do that, then you essentially create a de facto international price on carbon. I'm not the kind of person who would support just a domestic price on carbon just because I don't think it works. But I think that through this policy, if you do it the right way, you can create an international price on carbon. So maybe that's an international carbon tax, right? But if you do it the right way, then guess what happens? Countries that are looking to export into that carbon club are going to think twice before they invest in carbon-intensive technologies, right? Because it reduces their competitiveness when it comes to their exports, and then vice versa. Maybe you've got a country that is starting up a commercial nuclear program, or they're looking to expand it. well, that would provide them an additional incentive, right, to invest in those programs, and versus in contrast to doing something related to fossil fuels. And that opens up an entirely different conversation on U.S. civil nuclear foreign policy.
Yeah, thank you for that insight. I think that's really interesting. And actually, I think, Katrina, you'd be able to, you're in a position to really dive into some of these trade-specific or industry-specific implications. I know that we have a number of industries represented here, but two in particular, the oil and gas community as well as car manufacturers. And I'm wondering, and anticipating some of the questions that they may have here, is how would these industries fare under a climate and trade regime such as the one we're describing?
So I think we've well covered the domestic impacts. Great news. We have a lot to build on when it comes to the international side. So the U.S. government obviously can't have as exacting control over the conditions of international trade as we can over domestic, but we do have tools, policy tools that we can use to set industries up for success when it comes to international competition too. So the first is that we've been talking about the border carbon adjustment applying a price as goods come into the country. That's just one side of the border adjustment. The other side is you take the carbon price off as goods leave. And that means any other country can treat these goods however they like. If they have a different carbon price, terrific. If we're joined with them in some form of a carbon customs union or club, terrific. But we give our own industries a lot more liberty to compete on a level playing field internationally too. It becomes much more difficult to remove something like a regulatory intervention from the price of a good as it's exported. It's really straightforward with a domestic carbon fee. So that's the first way, is that we can actually alleviate some of the price pressure from having ambitious domestic climate policy and level the playing field for international trade. The second way is that we're going to remove a lot of the domestic impetus to impose really burdensome regulations. So we can continue to develop American oil and gas here at home. We can continue to have a thriving, growing manufacturing sector because we're removing the impetus to address carbon emissions in some other way that we know will have more of a price burden to industry. So a really important benefit of picking best solutions first. And then I think to the point that we've heard from Sarah and Dave, we're talking about a really significant paradigm shift in the international community. So while the conditions of global trade today make it costless to invest in coal, to sort of prop up dirtier ways of manufacturing all of the same goods, that benefit is going to be erased. Right, so the European Union has already offered a carbon border adjustment mechanism. It might not take effect the way it looks, but it will take effect. The United States has been openly considering a border adjustment. Canada, UK, Japan, all openly considering border carbon adjustments. If you add those economies together, we're talking about more than half of GDP, global domestic product, global economy. Which means that the largest consumer markets in the world are all going to care about the carbon intensity of production as goods come in. So we have to give American companies, American manufacturers, American oil and gas the opportunity to compete on their climate benefits, which they already have.
Great, thank you. We have about 15 to 20 minutes left in our conversation, so I'm going to scrap the other questions that I drafted and get questions from the audience. We've talked at you enough, and again, I apologize for the lateness of your meals. So would love to throw it over to you for questions at our panel. Sir, I see you have a question. Would you like to pose?
Thank you, Chrissy. And, hi to the panel. I'm Ed Bristois with the American Chemistry Council. Sarah, great to see you. We overlapped at USTR for a couple of years, so nice to see you. So American Chemistry Council, we represent U.S. chemical manufacturers. Clearly, chemical manufacturing is a carbon-intensive, trade-exposed industry. We are watching all of this unfold very closely because at some point in the future, all of these CBAMs could potentially impact U.S. chemical exports. It's complex, though, because the production of chemicals itself is complex, involves a lot of different supply chains, including in North America, around the world. I want to touch on the trade part. We've seen a race to the bottom in terms of trade behavior over the last 5 years. I don't want to dwell on that, but I think it's important to prevent a future race to the bottom here, and to, instead of acting unilaterally, act multilaterally, and to prevent those retaliatory actions by trading partners if the United States does something they don't like, or if other countries do something we don't like, and we get into this like emotional swell of action and reaction. So I really want to know more about what is the path towards multilateralizing a regime that is WTO compatible for carbon border adjustments, and is that even possible anymore in light of the tensions that have been created at the WTO and the lack of reform? Thanks.
You want to go first?
I'm happy to start. I mean, this is the $1 million question. I think you hit the nail on the head. It's not going to be easy. It's going to be, I think, extremely complicated. What we know is this: when the U.S. has gone out to negotiate bilateral and regional trade agreements, we have an enforceability mechanism that allows us to put very very progressive, strong environmental commitments into those agreements and back them up by sanctions if other countries aren't playing by the rules. We don't have that other than with the 21 or 22 trading partners, right? So when we're thinking about on a multilateral basis, think about Paris, but it's really hard to hold people's feet to the fire as we are finding out, right? That's why I think that while complicated, we can get there if we look at a multilateral system that takes into account the three pieces that I was talking about. Because if you have a set of like-minded countries who can agree that they are going to like really push forward, exempt each other from the carbon measures and work together, but also they have the safety valve of being able to tax countries that are not meeting those standards, and then at the same time you're bringing up this set of developing countries, I think you get there. It's not going to be easy. WTO, super complicated right now, not sure where that's all going to land, but the WTO agreements do provide for measures to be taken for these purposes, and I think hopefully there would be some flexibility and some wiggle room to see some measures leveling the playing field, with the argument that if the U.S. or the EU or another sort of like-minded country were to impose a carbon tax on, say, an import of Chinese steel that is massively government subsidized, the product of structural excess overcapacity, and flouting of the rules, things like that they would be able to take that measure and defend against that in the WTO, that that import doesn't deserve to be treated the same as an import that is produced by the rules. So I think it's a question that we're going to be hearing a lot more of and needing to discuss more, but I'm glad that you're thinking about it.
Dave, Katrina, do you have any thoughts before we take another question?
Yeah, just really fast. Yeah, you'll never be able to negotiate this through the WTO, right? I mean, that's kind of a non-starter. Yeah. I agree. I think it needs to be plurilateral. I think it needs to be a critical mass of economies to make it effective. I think it probably it should be focused on sectors by sectors, right? It shouldn't just be, blanket. But I also think it needs to be inclusive, right? Because the worst case scenario is that you go down this pathway, you act unilaterally, the EU does its thing, we do our thing, Japan does its thing, etc. And then this becomes just a guise for green protectionism. Right? And that's what developing countries will say, that's what the Chinese will say. They'll create their own systems. So we'll have this balkanized way of counting emissions, and it'll totally undermine the Paris Agreement if we do it the wrong way, okay? So us approaching this from when we're talking about a U.S. policy design, it needs to be compatible with the concept of creating a carbon club. And that's probably one of my criticisms of the EU CBAM proposal, because although I agree with using emissions performance as the standard, I think that makes a lot of sense. There is the exemption, the full exemption piece is really narrowly focused, where you've got to have a price on carbon, needs to be linked to their ETS. It's too narrowly focused on pricing carbon. We've got to have a more inclusive system that allows countries in different carbon regulatory development to participate. For some countries, they'll have a price on carbon. For other countries, they won't.
I'll just add that this problem of tackling carbon emissions embedded in trade isn't new. For like the last 15 years, the WTO has said, oh, we can't handle climate, you go talk to the UNFCCC, and the UNFCCC has said, oh, we can't handle trade, you go talk to the WTO. I mean, they have published joint reports that basically say that. There's no venue. There's no venue to negotiate these multilateral agreements right now. We need to create the pressure to create that venue. And that's going to happen as we start talking about these economic benefits that we can extract for individual economies.
Great. Yes, Jeremy. We'll get to you next, Drew.
Thanks, Chrissy. Jeremy Furchgott. I study China. I'm really curious to hear the panel's thoughts on the accuracy of carbon data coming out of places like China. We've seen that in other areas, Chinese data is either missing or inaccurate or purposely distorted. GDP data, COVID data, demographic data, manufacturing output, and so if we were to live in a world where the carbon inputs into Chinese goods had to be quantified, what is the risk of the Chinese government manipulating that data through multilateral organizations or just through other ways? And if we could guess the accuracy of this data, would it be like, I've never worked with this data, so I have no idea, but could it be that we think that from the outside we can estimate it plus or minus 5%, plus or minus 30%? Like, how much potential is there for accuracy or manipulation of this kind of data?
It's a data question, Katrina. I feel like this is up your alley.
I'll start. So, we have abundant challenges when it comes to trusting the veracity of data from certain sources. The Chinese government will lay out greenhouse gas targets for an economic sector, and then by some miracle, if you add up facility by facility emissions, it somehow meets that target every year. So, not sure that we're getting emissions data. That means that we've got to be really careful about what we trust, how we trust it. There are changes happening, right? So the new Climate Trace program is using satellite imagery to verify emissions data. I don't know if we should be confident in output yet, but the days of sort of skating by on these political promises about emissions, those are coming to an end. We also have backstops that we can use. So we might not be able to trust that Chinese data is totally accurate, let's say. So if you're trying to import steel from a specific facility in China to the United States, and you want to claim that your steel is made with hydropower or is very clean, terrific, show us. So by imposing these kinds of border measures, we have the ability to set rules about data availability, about data verification, about transparency, and we can leverage those so that we can increase confidence about those numbers as they're coming out of countries and facilities that we don't necessarily trust off the bat. So we have to build those considerations into whatever we do to connect climate and trade, because they're a significant obstacle to pricing emissions as we want to, offering competitive benefits to clean firms as we want to.
Any extra thoughts before we turn over to Drew?
I would only make one other remark on that, which is, depends on where we end up and on all of this, but I think, and it's something that I've talked to a number of folks about, is, if we have to, we should be looking to impose disclosure requirements And if you don't disclose, maybe this is through UNFCCC, I'm not sure exactly, but if you don't disclose or the veracity of your data is in question, that adverse inferences could be taken. And this comes into play when you're talking about, imposing a carbon price, right? If I can't trust what you're telling me, and we have our own let's assume U.S. adopts a carbon price at some point, and we move forward with a carbon border adjustment, and we're asking for data from China or many other countries whose data may be in question. We've got to figure it out. We've got to either have those countries change the way that they're reporting it, or we need to be able to refute that through satellite and other technology, or we need to draw an adverse inference. We've done this time and again at the WTO on subsidies. China is notorious for not disclosing their subsidies. It's a huge problem. There needs to be a consequence.
Thanks. So my name is Drew Vaughn. I'm the president of the Conservative Coalition for Climate Solutions. If you haven't heard of us, we're only about a year old. So please look us up. We have a news magazine called c3newsmag.com. Our focus is on free market solutions. And so, Katrina, I love your data. I want to dig into it more because one of our first publications that we did earlier this year is called Free Economies Are Clean Economies. And it actually took decades of data that the Heritage Foundation has compiled with their Index of Economic Freedom and correlated that with Yale's Environmental Performance Index and showed how the fact that as countries become more economically free, they also become more clean. So one of the things we'd love to do is to better understand how do they become more clean from a carbon perspective, not just from a holistic environmental perspective. So we'd love to talk to you more about that. Dave and I have had long conversations about the border carbon adjustment. I'm a conservative. I think conservatives are just skeptical by nature, skeptical of government, certainly, but always interested in trying to better understand the policy and understand the best approach. And Dave and I are completely aligned in terms of our desire for America to win, for manufacturing to come back, for the U.S. competitiveness to be there, for us to work well with our allies around the country. And so, my question really is perhaps one, because I don't still quite understand the border carbon adjustment, but I'm thinking about our friends in the international community here. And when you show the data, Katrina, of why and how the U.S. wins under a border carbon adjustment, I'm trying to think through, why would they want to be a part of that club? So simple question, maybe it comes from just pure ignorance and not understanding the mechanism. So if you could just help me understand that, that'd be great.
Sure. So we can start with the data, but I'm sure my colleagues have stuff to add too. So maybe I can. Do you have the clicker? Yeah. Sorry. Now that you have food, I can make you pay the price again. So I just want to pull up the dizzying chart. The only market that we have on here that has more blue boxes than red boxes is the European Union. Now, when I was building this data, I fully expected that the European Union would be a lot better at beating the United States out on carbon efficiency. They've been pricing carbon in their market for a whole lot longer. They just edge us out a little bit. So feather in the cap, another climate good news story for American industry. But there's good reason for the European Union to see that they would benefit domestic industry if they start pricing carbon. The industries that the European Union chose to start with in CBAM are sort of a test case. But as they expand the footprint of pricing traded emissions, they can see benefit too. Also, we trade disproportionately, right, with Canada and Mexico. There's a benefit to them for staying in with the United States on something that looks like a carbon customs union or a carbon club, because they're our trading partners, right? Our economies are deeply intertwined. So even though they have slightly higher carbon emissions than the United States does for the same kind of production events, they're close trading partners. There's dramatic benefit for linking with them in some kind of multilateral, plurilateral system. So it's not just that you benefit domestic firms because of their carbon advantage, it's that you benefit your domestic economy because you're partnering with the cleanest economies in the world that use your goods disproportionately and help you create value. So while we can get that edge in early on for like the steel industry, right, if we start off, and we're really creating sort of a force multiplier for countries working together on climate and trade at the same time.
And theoretically, they should gain some market share in the United States, right?
Theoretically.
And the U.S. would gain market share in the EU, for example.
I think we have time for 2 more questions before, I know that unless folks have a back end on this. Who else has a question? Yes, sir.
Thank you. Dan Byers, U.S. Chamber of Commerce. This is a great conversation. Kudos to all of you. Good to see you all. I guess question mostly for Dave, but for anyone. You mentioned Paris. As I think about sort of this issue and I watch how countries are positioning, one of the things that I see as a really big hurdle is, the Paris Agreement is founded on the notion of common but differentiated responsibilities. Everyone will put together their own nationally determined contribution, and we're all in, we'll work together kind of at their own pace. And then we turn around and we'll say, well, we may slap a tariff on you if we don't like what you're actually doing or your contribution isn't enough. Do you have any thoughts on circling that square? It's been interesting to see, Secretary Kerry kind of, when he's been asked about this, he's thrown some cold water on it. I think they want to get past Glasgow and worry about border carbon adjustments down the road, because you got a lot of countries like India and many others that are saying, don't you dare. So any thoughts on how that might play out, or what's the response to a country like India when they say, hey, we're developing, and beyond just, the exemptions, which you can exempt all day long, and then all of a sudden it's ineffective. Any thoughts on that? Thank you.
I totally agree. I think that is a really important question to sort of tease through. I think that probably Special Envoy Kerry is playing the good cop to the EU's bad cop, right? In these conversations with India and others. And that's probably one of the reasons why, if you look at the Coons-Peters bill, that those exemptions are like really easy to get, right? I think it's just, you got similar climate ambition, and you give us an exemption, right? So it's not even based on emissions performance. There's clearly, so if you look at the Paris Agreement, so there are arguments for and against. Right. So, and by the way, and I would put the Framework Convention in that as well, because you're right. I mean, Paris is bottom up. You determine your own nationally determined contribution, your own pledge, right? And here's the EU and perhaps the U.S. and the G7 plus coming in and going, oh, okay, well, we're creating this trade policy that's going to force you to, I shouldn't say force, but it's going to compel you to be competitive, to do things that you probably wouldn't have done without that. Okay, and there's, and that is, that's a valid point that they put forward. But on the other hand, keep in mind that with the Paris Agreement, we have a collective goal, right, of 2 degrees, global net zero emissions in the second half of the century. And I don't know how you achieve that goal without some merger of climate and trade policy, simply because the amount of investment that we need to go into greening global supply chains, right, and deploying those type of low carbon technologies and systems surpasses anything that the public domain could do, right? So you've got to create a market, and it's got to have, again, a critical mass of economies involved to do it. But then again, you've got to be inclusive, right? You can't, the Indians, the Chinese just can't look at this and go, this is BS, right? This is just protectionism. And this is where I think a plurilateral sectoral approach that creates competition within the industry, right? That's just based on emissions performance, not necessarily anything else. But are you the cleanest in the world? And if you're the cleanest in the world, right, you don't get charged anything. You don't get charged a carbon tax. If you're second, you get charged little. If you get third, more than second. And theoretically, a state-owned enterprise in China, assuming that they were playing by the rules, right? But a state-owned enterprise in China or some company in India should be given the opportunity to meet that GOAT standard, right? Regardless of what the host government's climate policy is.
Let's do one more question, and then we can close and let everyone enjoy their meals and network. I realize that we've captured your attention for a really long time. So, who wants does anyone have an important note to close on? Happy to answer one more question. I'm not above calling on people. But I won't do it this time. Let's just turn to the panel. Thank you again for all of this. Would love to get your closing remarks. If there's anything that we didn't touch on today, I think we highlighted a number of really important issues. But if there's anything left unsaid that you guys think that would be really helpful for this audience in closing, would love to hear it. So Katrina, would you like to begin? And then Sarah and then Dave.
Thanks, Chrissy. So I guess I'll just leave you with this. All of the data that I've been using to tell the story of the American carbon advantage is a really great climate news story. We have those. We have those here in the United States. We're doing a good job. There's a lot that we can build from as we think about sort of leveraging new policy solutions. But the United States is doing a really terrific job at reducing emissions, even in the absence of a coherent federal policy. It's not all bad news. Don't let anybody tell you that. We've got a lot to build from. Thanks.
I think if I could leave you with a takeaway, it would be that, we can't have a patchwork of measures here. If the U.S. partners with like-minded countries, they can find a path forward together that doesn't increase tariffs on each other. And we can also find a path forward where it's not just leveling the playing field with countries like China, but actually giving them an incentive to join the club, right? And that's a nuance. It's not just we want to tax you and tariff your products. It's we want you to do the right things so you can get in the club, right? Like our objective isn't to tax you. That's not what we want. Our objective is to do better for the environment, level the playing field for everybody. So.
And look, I mean, this is a very new policy concept in a lot of ways, right? And and we're just now sort of digging into what does this mean. We really need to have a detailed conversation, a deep dive into what the strategic objective should be with this type of policy. And I think in doing so, I think a lot of Republicans, and I think Democrats too, but a lot of Republicans will walk away going, wow, this is a potential game changer for U.S. foreign economic policy, right? Something that we can really leverage to achieve a lot of our national security objectives. So thank you.
That's great. Well, thank you. Thank you very much, Katrina, Sarah, Dave, for your insights today. I think this was a really important conversation. It's a good, as Congressman Peters said, an important conversation starter. So we're grateful to you. We're grateful to Congressman Peters for his participation. Also grateful to Heather Reams and the National Clean Energy Week team for being here. Thank you to our Conservation Council partners, our international partners. Thanks for taking so much time out of your day to be with us for this. Before you go, I have one last plug for next week. We're hosting a next virtual congressional briefing on the IPCC report, which is going to be great. We just confirmed the lead deputy climate chief with the White House OSTP for keynote remarks. And then we're going to also have the vice chair of the IPCC also deliver remarks and then moderate a conversation with many of the lead authors. So it's going to be also a very good congressional briefing. I'll follow up with more information about that, but would love your participation on our briefing next week as well. So with that, I'll close. Thank you again for being here, and please consider us to be ongoing partners to you at ICCF.